random topics that somehow relate to sci-fi and horror. 1984's The Terminator is a true classic. Director James Cameron crafted a one-in-a-million masterpiece of action and sci-fi, but is there more to the film than that? Are fans and critics alike overlooking a third aspect that is much stronger than we remember? What I'm referring to is a much forgotten horror angle, an angle that was pretty central to the atmosphere of the first film. Now, to be honest, most people would scratch their heads at that. The Terminator is hardly remembered for its horror elements, rather its action. But it's actually the horror elements that make the action that much more effective, so let's examine this a bit closer.
This is great stuff. I could make a career out of this guy.
Obviously, The Terminator is about a robot from the apocalyptic future traveling to the past to try to kill Sarah Connor, the to-be mother of a leader of the resistance. She meets up with Kyle Reese, sent to the past to save her, and the future itself.
Come with me if you want to live.
Now, sure, this seems like a pretty actiony film, but if we strip the movie down to the basics, we kind of get an 80s slasher film along the lines of Halloween or Friday the 13th. In fact, James Cameron is said to have thought up the idea of the Terminator after having a nightmare about a metallic creature dragging itself away from an explosion, holding knives and crawling towards him. A pretty haunting image, which is more or less exactly what is shown towards the end of the film. Also, think about the period, 1984. John Carpenter's Halloween was released in 1979, had become a huge hit, and was in on its third entry in the series at the time. The Friday the 13th franchise was going to release its fourth, and in my opinion, best entry in the series, and Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street was released the same year as Terminator. In other words, slasher horror films were not only in, but also very successful, and James Cameron was well aware of this, as he's quoted as saying the following when talking about the Terminator. My contemporaries were all doing slasher horror movies. John Carpenter was the guy I idolized the most. He made Halloween for $30,000 or something. That was everyone's break-in dream, to do a stylish horror movie, and it really was the launching pad for the story. So let's make some more connections, starting with the Terminator himself, played excellently by Arnold Schwarzenegger in a suitably one-note and robotic performance. We have this strong, silent, merciless, non-human killer. Almost no dialogue uttered, cutting through innocent people like a hot knife through butter, and he himself getting up time and time again even after being shot. One shot that makes the inspiration clear is a part after the club shootout where the Terminator gets up in a very slasher villain kind of way. The club shootout in itself is almost shot and edited as a horror film. The music, tension, atmosphere, everything is slowly turned up in what is a genuinely unnerving and suspenseful scene. Physically, the Terminator is also very imposing. Buff and hulking like Jason Voorhees, silent and deadly like Michael Myers, and with a very specific kind of look. The leather jacket and sunglasses might as well be his machete and hockey mask, a mask that when removed reveals the true face of a monster. The monster that James Cameron saw in his dreams, and brought to reality, much like another famous slasher horror villain. Still don't believe me? Let's trek through the film. So, we have a strong, almost unstoppable non-human force killing off Sarah Connors until he gets to the last one. The last Sarah Connor, or the final girl, as you would say in horror and slasher films. The way the cold robotic killer picks off anyone in his way is very similar to how a slasher villain would kill those in between him and his victim. The most telling example of slasher villainry is when the Terminator shows up at Sarah Connor's apartment, only to find her roommate and boyfriend who were just recently having sex. What follows is a scene that could just as easily have been in a Friday the 13th film, where the act of sex is almost always punished by death. courtesy of our slasher villain who ends up facing off against the often virgin final girl. Now, admittedly, we wouldn't have a story if Sarah Connor was a virgin, as the birth of her future son is kind of a catalyst for this plot, but the killing of horny teens is a slasher staple that the Terminator also succumbs to. The overly dark and gruesome tone gives all the action much more weight, especially the police station shootout, which is not only legendary, but pretty horrific, almost like a nightmare where no matter how much you hit the monster, he doesn't feel it. It's not really a shootout either, it's a massacre. Much like the ones Freddy and Jason would dish out, where no matter the retaliation they receive, they just keep cutting people down. Finally, we have a chilling climax. An exciting car chase scene culminates in an explosion, stripping off of fake flesh that has made the Terminator appear human, and giving us the scene that James Cameron saw in his nightmares. Sarah Connor is chased by this horrifying metal skeleton with glowing red eyes, reaching and jumping out at her like a slasher villain would, until the final girl kills the monster in the very last second. So, why does this action classic play the tunes of a slasher horror film? Well, like I said, in 1984, the directors Cameron respected and admired were all doing slasher horror. However, the genre was getting a little overpopulated with knockoffs and unoriginal content. So, how do you make a slasher horror film stand out in the sea of lookalikes? Easy. You disguise it as an action sci-fi flick. The horror atmosphere and beats make it an action film unlike many others, and the unique content and setting make it stand out even more. It's basically a slasher film dressed up as an action movie. And after all, clothes make the man, or in this case the cyborg, though it still won't erase what's underneath. It's pretty damn amazing that one of the most influential action films of all time started out as an homage to cheesy slasher films. But as we've seen time and time again, talent, ambition, and creativity will make an otherwise overdone concept seem fresh. So, that about does it for this episode of Sci-Fi Night Light. We hope you enjoyed it. And what do you think? Is The Terminator really a horror film in disguise? Let me know in the comments below. I'm your host, Sebastian Vendel Martinez, and I'll catch you guys next time.
Fuck you, asshole.